So today we're having John Gregg as our speaker, and John is an attorney at a rather large and important law firm in D.C., and I looked up a little bit of information about this. I want to share with you, because one of the reasons we do these classes is to help us get acquainted with other people in our congregation. And John, I know, loves this church. He's been heavily engaged in all kinds of activities here for many years. And so I've been trying for a long time to get him to come and speak in Rustlers, and so we finally succeeded today. He joined McCarter & English, LLP, became the managing partner of its D.C. office in 2014. He has been a principal in the law firm of Miller, Bayless & O'Neill since 1992. He represented primarily local gas distribution companies' regulatory transaction matters arising from the unbundling of the interstate pipeline industry. So sometime we'll have to have you explain that.
Very good. I love that.
That'd be a big crowd draw.
John testified before Congress on the impact of FERC's order that and argued the appeal of the order before the United States Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia Circuit. Mr. Gregg advises clients on energy contracts, including prepaid natural gas agreements. He served as special gas counsel to the Public Energy Authority of Kentucky, which issued nearly $2 billion of municipal bonds to purchase long-term supplies of natural gas since 1998. In 2003, John assisted 3 South Carolina public gas authorities from the nation's newest public gas joint action agency, the Patriots Energy Group. McCarter, his firm, has been one of the leading pro bono programs in the country and was ranked in the top 100 firms by the American Lawyer in 2012. So his firm has received an A grade for pro bono work from the New Jersey Law Journal. The firm recognizes its obligation to encourage participation in pro bono work and provides unlimited billable credit to associates who perform this pro bono work. So I thought that's another angle on generosity, which is our topic today. So he's also leads the charitable foundation of the Energy Bar Association, and he has been the Clerk of Session here at National Presbyterian Church since 2011. So John, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Paul. I've been introduced a lot in the church, and no one's ever read my professional resume before. That's very strange. Thank you for the invitation to talk about one of my favorite topics, money. I have been in the church a long time, and I think I know many of you. We have a special guest star here today, Laura Treadway, my spouse. We just celebrated last month our 30th anniversary of being married across the street there. In fact, I'm reminded this morning of my first Sunday school teaching job. It didn't come in Wrestlers. It came in about 1989 when Peggy Campbell asked Laura and I to teach the senior high school. And that seemed fine because I'd been running around the gym with Mitch Gore for a couple of years, and that was fine. And then the first semester went great. And the second semester, Peggy said, okay, now we're going to do a unit on sex education. And I said, no, we're not. Oh, yeah, so who better to teach the children about sex than you two? I said, oh, certainly somebody else. Of course, today, Laura and I reflect that those children are in their 40s, and many have their own children. So I guess we didn't mess that up too badly, and I have some confidence to go forward with the Wrestlers class this morning.
Your coffee cup's in the way, though. Your coffee cup's in the way.
Coffee cup's in the way, that's bad. All right, Paul, you want to turn the lights on? We're good. We got to time this topic a little bit to go with our stewardship season, which was nice. And our slogan, say yes to living generously, like a lot of slogans, is easy to say, but maybe it's hard to do. Let me ask you to begin. I want you to begin by asking to engage your brain a little bit and just think with me for a second. Think, if you would, of the most generous people or persons you've encountered in your life. Think of that person's name, if you can, and think why it is you think that person is generous? Do you think of that person? Raise your hand if you have that person's name in hand. Raise your hand. Great. Call out their name and tell me why they were generous.
Oh, it was my father.
For what reason?
It was during the Depression. He saw a number of people with whom he worked who were really at the bottom of the pile for any money. He was loaning money.
You gave him money.
Gave him money, and most of the time nobody knew this.
Right.
And if they insisted on repayment, he'd have them pay in some other form, like a piece of art or whatever.
Rick, what kind of generosity do you remember?
Yeah, my dad also, and he just was aware of our living situations, and when we were young men growing up, he just found a way to help us, and he did the same thing with others, especially with his time. He was a major giver of
Not
time.
just money, but time, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So start with that frame of mind of thinking about real people. I give you a more highfalutin definition of generosity. The virtue of giving good things to others freely and abundantly. Good things, not just any kind of things, but something that actually has a virtuous thing that does good for somebody else. Importantly, we would say that this is a learned character trait. It involves both attitude and action, and orientation as well as taking an act. And keep in mind this morning the idea that generosity isn't just something that happens randomly, haphazardly, but it's really a result of a personal orientation to life, an intentional decision that people make to act in a particular way. So generosity, like all the other virtues, is in people's genuine enlightened self-interest to learn and practice because it's a virtue. Just briefly, the etymology of the word generosity is kind of interesting. It's not a kind of a normal word that was a common thing, but it came up as the result of describing rather aristocratic or noble people. It came up in the 16th century to reflect aristocratic sense of a noble lineage or high birth. To be generous was literally a way of saying to belong to nobility. So it's not, etymologically at least, something is basic to human character as truth-telling or stealing. It's more of an ideal to which we aspire like a virtue. Interestingly, it's interesting to contrast generosity with altruism. Altruism is when you really do something that's not in your self-interest. It's clearly not in your self-interest. But we can argue that generosity, and I will, is in your self-interest. So people can be authentically generous for reasons in a way that actually secures their own interests. So if generosity is a virtue, to practice it for the good of others necessarily means that doing it achieves our overall sense of well-being. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit this morning. Keep in mind that generosity can mean a lot of different things. It's not just giving money to the poor or people who don't have money, but also, importantly, giving our time and attention to people who need it. Aid, encouragement, and emotional availability is important. Are we called to, as Christians, to be generous? I put together my presentation, I realized I didn't even address this, because I thought it was so self-evident, right? Of course it's self-evident. You don't think it's self-evident. Well, what's the second commandment? Love others as we would love each other. When Paul was bidding farewell to the folks in the Greek islands before he returned in Acts 2 to Jerusalem, he says famously, remember what our Lord says, it's better to give than receive. famous words live and resonate so much with our lives today. So I'd say it was kind of self-evident, but you can argue with me later. Yeah. Our pastor said a couple weeks ago, quoting this author, Ben Gill, that the happiest people on earth are the people that give. This was a book about a pastor's own reflection of his life as a pastor. And what I want to talk with you about today is a scientific study kind of intended to try to prove this point. The generosity paradox.
Can I ask you one question? I won't argue, I'll just ask a question. The reason, it's connected with the reason I said it's not self-evident. And the question is, you said that generosity achieves our overall sense of well-being. Is that a Christian goal?
Hold on to that. That's a big question.
Yes, it is. It goes to the heart of what you're doing.
I agree. We know a paradox is a seemingly self-contradictory proposition. So the generosity paradox is simply that if by giving things away, you're actually increasing your own self. So by being generous and giving of ourselves and our possessions, we're actually increasing our own well-being. That's a paradox. The paradox is ancient. It's found here in Proverbs 11. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. Kind of raises this conundrum, or even another paradox. If being generous is actually good for you, then why don't we do it more? There is a lot of social science about philanthropy and generosity. If you are inclined, just Google it. It's amazing what's out there. And what I came across last year was a new book by the well-known author Kristen Smith called Paradox of Generosity. And here's the book. And it flows out of a project done at Notre Dame called the Science of Generosity Initiative. So what they did in that project was a scientific sociological survey of 2,000 Americans, from which they culled scientifically a group of about 560 to get 40 in-depth interviews with households in 12 states, including both Maryland and the district, interestingly enough, so that their researchers spent a considerable amount of time with them personally, not just interviewing them, but spending a little time with them, going to the grocery store, maybe even going to meetings with them or to church, trying to get to know them and to try to understand their thinking about generosity a little more deeply, as well as to get some basic survey responses. The first question is, that they wanted to answer is, well, does being generous make you happier? And they would say that happiness is a self-evident good. You know, people want to be happy. And they created a couple of questions to try to identify what made people happy, and came up with this scale. And reported something that's not huge, but very statistically significant. It says that, you know, from 38% to 10%, people who tithe, people who give 10% or more of their income away, say that they are happy, very happy, versus somewhat happy. And conversely, people who don't do that are less happy. Volunteering is another way of being generous. And volunteering creates the same correlated response, that people who volunteer say that they are happier by a 35 to 17 ratio of people who volunteer. And even by people who don't volunteer, there is a correlation, but it's not as great. They also came up with an idea that it's very self-evident, I think, called relational generosity, for which the pattern holds. So, relational generosity refers to people who respond to the needs of other people. People who stop the pattern of their own life to attend to the needs of others. They try to identify people or have people self-identify with statements like they thought that they went the extra mile to take care of their friends or their relatives, maybe when they were sick. People who said that the happiness of other people around them was very important to them. People who said their decisions in their personal life often involved considering the feelings of other people around them. And this creates something called relational generosity. And people who practice that also prove to be a little happier. A little subset of that is neighborly generosity. Are you aware of who your neighbors are? Do you take the kids in from the neighbor to help out mom next door? Do you look in on the single elderly person who's alone? Do you take in your neighbor's newspapers or pet when they're away? Just basic stuff, being part of a neighborhood community. People who do that on a weekly basis are very happy by a 52 to 10% ratio. So there's a very high correlation there. Another one that's very well understood in our country, I think, is volunteering. Almost everybody says that volunteering makes people happier. I mean, 96%. They correlated that with health, by some indications of health, and said people who volunteer are much more likely to be in very good health than poor health as compared to people that don't volunteer. Not surprisingly, those health benefits of volunteering are trumpeted by volunteer organizations. And it's backed up by a lot of other research out there, including Gallup research, to show that there's a strong correlation. And of course, that's very important to our seniors in this country, because a lot of these organizations reach out to seniors who have a lot of time to volunteer, and the health benefits of this seem to be real. And that's something that you might hear about. Of course, it goes back to the Harvard professor, Robert Putnam, who started talking about these relationships breaking down in bowling alone in 2011, or 2001, which is now almost 15 years ago. Another indicator that they measured in their survey was having a purpose in life. And they came up with a few questions that tried to get at measuring purpose. Did you have a plan for your life? Did you feel that you were on the right track? Did you live purposefully? Things like that. And again, they found that people who tithe were much more likely to feel that they had purpose in their life than people who didn't. Another interesting sociological find is that people who are generous have happier marriages. That's kind of self-evident when you think about it. If both parties are generous to one another, as opposed to just one, you're more likely to have a happier relationship. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, does generosity cause greater well-being, or does greater well-being cause generosity? So the causality question is a really, really good one. And our authors of this study are not shy to try to deal with that. They admit this is a complex issue. And they would say that you can't say that it's like a rifle shot of causality, that one particular thing causes things, because these are interrelational issues. And the critics of generosity would tend to rely, in their view, more on one-directional causation, and they don't. They're quick to admit that generous practices do not improve well-being magically. It's not like taking a pill. So what they came up with were 9 interrelated causal mechanisms that, when you think about them, I think have some self-evident truth to them. So I'm going to read them to you and let you decide. These are what they call a mechanism, way that we relate to each other. The first one is generosity often fosters and reinforces positive emotions and reduces negative emotions in givers, which tends to lead to greater happiness and health. So I think that maybe when you volunteer your time to a cause, you take some pride in that. Can you be angry when you're serving soup to a homeless person? Do you have some different perspective on life when you're volunteering, helping other people? Second one, generosity often triggers chemical systems in the brain and body that increase pleasure and experience of reward, reduce stress, suppress pain, and lead to greater happiness and health. Well, neuroscience research is somewhat new and somewhat mind-blowing when you think about it. But it's in its early stages, but we've all read about the reward centers in our brain lighting up when certain things happen and how important that is to our sense of well-being. And there is work about generosity creating that kind of warm glow effect. Paul Zach of the Claremont Graduate School says that human beings have a physiologic moral compass. That means that not only does happiness come from leading a virtuous life, if you remember Aristotle, but also societies would be more virtuous if people, more people lived a virtuous life. So there'd be happier societies. His research program would support, our authors say, the idea that generosity is one of the key virtues that leads to happiness. Number 3, generosity increases personal agency and self-efficacy, which tends to increase happiness. Personal agency and self-efficacy is the stuff that you talk to your teenagers about ad nauseum, or in my case, your 22-year-old. Your ability to get it together and make things happen in your life. Example given is a young adult who made a decision, I think, to give to World Vision monthly to support a child. And the point is to be able to get your affairs together to make that $30 a month contribution suggests that you're able to organize things in a more mature way. And there's a benefit of that that leads to happiness. Number 4, generosity often creates positive, meaningful social roles and personal self-identities for givers to live out. This is a little weaker in my view, but sometimes you, especially if you think of volunteering, sometimes you participate in a social network of people that helps you self-identify with other givers, which is a positive thing. Generosity tends to reduce maladaptive self-absorption. This is, again, my former teenager. Stated differently, people are often better to cope with themselves the less they focus on themselves. So navel gazers tend to dwell on the negative aspects of their lives, versus people who are active and loving and giving tend to focus outwardly and see the world in a different way. And we'll come back to that one. Practicing generosity requires and reinforces the perception of living in a world of abundance and blessing. Practicing generosity requires and reinforces the perception of living in a world of abundance and blessing. Maybe this is the single most important thing, and we'll come back to that one. Generosity expands the number and density of social network relational ties. I think we covered that one. And generosity tends to promote increased learning about the world. certainly there are so many ways in which you can be a volunteer or a giver. It is a little overwhelming. And there's so many things to learn about how you can make an impact on the world with your dollars, certainly through our church. It is rather eye-opening. So it gives you a different perspective, I think, on the world. Generosity tends to increase givers' physical activity. Well, certainly we see that in volunteering. Go swing a hammer for Habitat for Humanity and you might feel better. Bottom line in all this is that generosity is something that needs to be practiced. Generosity means something more to a person and actually has these impacts when it's routine and brought into the life of the person. When they asked people if they filled out a donor card when they got their driver's license, they didn't see these correlations. There's not much that goes into doing that. There's arguably not even that much that goes into giving blood, they would find. But when you reorient yourself to a giving life, that's when you change and you have these effects. Let's talk about American generosity. Do you think Americans are generous? Well, last year, Americans gave more money than ever before as measured by a survey that's the leading survey on this. 7% up from the previous year, $358 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. On average, almost $3,000 per household. An article just last week talked about donor-advised funds being at their highest level ever. This is when you give a big chunk of money at one single time, derive a tax advantage of making the donation in one single tax period, and then distribute the money at your discretion later on and manage that money in a very intentional way where it becomes kind of a routine thing. Maybe that's a part of our deal here. But those have never been more frequent either. In America, interestingly, by far, most money is given by individuals. Certainly foundations, corporations, and then bequests of technically not individuals, but other entities, like illegal entities like trusts, are part of it. But by far and away, most of the money comes from
Is that dollars?
people.
Those
are dollars.
That's percent of dollars? Wow. That's surprising.
Then, of course, American volunteerism is really legendary and very different than most people in the world, certainly Europe. And people can date this to the observations of de Tocqueville when he came in the middle of the 19th century, or actually I guess earlier, and wrote his famous observations about Americans. He wrote, "I must say that I have seen Americans make a great deal of real sacrifices to the public welfare. And I've noticed 100 instances in which they hardly ever failed to lend a faithful support to one another." So some people measure that 1 out of 4 adults volunteers in our country and gives significant amounts of time. It's always been that religious institutions get the most bit of that time, with educational institutions and then social service groups in the community getting the next bit. The amount of time that religious organizations are getting is declining, in the same way that the amount of money they're getting is declining, and we'll come back to that. But are Americans really generous? What percent of Americans do you think tithe? The authors of this study believe about 2 to 3% of Americans actually tithe. There are some people think maybe it's a little higher. Some evangelical organizations would like to report that it's maybe as much as 8%. What's really interesting is if you ask people, do they tithe? Almost 23% say that they do tithe when they don't. So we could say that that's they don't understand what their real finances are, or they are misleading themselves. We don't know. The Barna Group, which is a rather well-known Christian organization, which would tend to say that tithing is higher, reported these numbers in 2012, which say that more than half of the people in America that are givers give less than $500. 22% less than $100, which doesn't seem very generous. What these numbers show is that there are a small number of individuals who give a great deal of money. So if we were to take out the top 10% of individuals who gave money, there wouldn't be much charitable giving. You can do a graph that's very hard to see that simply just spikes up in percentage in amount to the last amount. This kind of relates to the old 80-20 percentage thing we say in the church, that 20% of the people do all the work and do all the giving. It's actually even more skewed in the society when it comes to charitable giving, people say. So the fact of the matter is in America that the vast majority of people give hardly anything. So in our generous, self-perceived culture, those are the economic facts.
John, is that tied to churches or religion?
This is the whole country.
This is tithing as far as
tithing is
charitable.
Right. When I say tithing, it's I'm not saying it's going to a religious institution, but we're using that for the 10% measure. That's a whole other discussion, of course, not tithing. Arguably, people are confused a little bit about giving. Some of the statistics about what individuals do would say that. And people look for advice in the strangest places. I don't know how many of you ever seen online the Dow Jones Service Market Watch, but I just found this on the internet and I thought I'd share it with you. This is an advice column online. Dear Moneyologist, I recently joined a church and each week they pass the basket for collection. Some weeks half of what goes collected goes to a local organization for a food drive, and other weeks it's for the church. The minister says give what you can. On the one hand, I could technically give $100 a week and not go bankrupt. On the other hand, that seems excessive. When I was growing up, people would unload their spare change in the basket and you'd be lucky to see a $5 bill in the basket. At my church, I can't help but notice quite a few $20 and even $50 bills in the collection plate. How much should I give? Is there an acceptable or unacceptable amount? Joe, Milwaukee. Well, first, I saw that on my screen. My first reaction was a little bit of outrage. Why in the world is he asking the Market Watch personal finance column about his obligation to give to the church? And I thought, well, God bless him. At least he's asking, right? At least he's inquiring. Then I came back to, well, you know, I think he knows the answer. I think he's looking for an out from the financial guy. So I don't know. But I think it does reflect a little bit of confusion and personal angst about giving in our society.
What was the answer?
Oh, it's a great. Oh, I'm not going to tell you what the answer was. The answer was do what your heart tells you to do. It was unoffensive, of course. Why do people give money is a fantastic thing to talk about that I'm not prepared to talk about, not qualified to talk about. It is just so obviously complex. And in all the reading I've done about this over the years and even I think the authors of this study would say, we just don't have a great idea on why the ungenerous are ungenerous. We know some reasons, but you just can't say, it's hard, and you can't point to one thing. But it really is kind of an endlessly fascinating question, especially if like Rick, you've been on the stewardship committee for a long time. What is important, and what is very well, I think, understood, is that your outlook on life is determinative of your generosity. It's very clear from this study and all the people they met and they talked to that people in the exact same objective economic circumstance or personal circumstance go completely different ways on generosity. And it's because of their view subjectively? Do they view the world as a place of abundance, blessing, and sufficiency, or a place of scarcity, fear, and uncertainty? And certainly with money, that's a great place for anxiety. Certainly if you're a young person looking forward into life, it would be unusual if you had no anxiety about money. The very first question you see as a young person, adult, is how you pay for your education. In this country, it's a gigantic mountain of obligation and uncertainty. The next one seems to be your living situation. How can you afford a house? How can you afford a house in the Washington metropolitan area? I was at a conference the last few days with people from all over the country, several of whom grew up here. And almost every one of them who didn't live here said, man, how do you afford a house here? And they were much happier in their other places that they lived. And a lot of people ask the question when they get married before they have children, well, gee, can we even afford children? And then finally the question, how can I afford to retire? And increasingly, almost every American has to manage their own retirement. It's not managed for them. And that's a whole new source of a great deal of anxiety. I'm coming to me.
No, I have a comment on marriage.
Oh.
And,
why would that be?
No,
I'm sorry, we don't have time for that.
The marriage rate, as I think you all know, is trending down significantly. There was a new study out very recently, that a big part of that downtrend is actually attributable to the fact that people in those, what we would think of typically the years where they would get married in their 20s, are deferring because of student debt, inability to buy a home, and total uncertainty about their ability to just financially maintain themselves.
No question. So I think, especially for us as Christians, a really important question is the choice that you make. Which outlook do you choose for yourself? You can say that for a lot of people, scarcity is an imagined thing, and it corrodes happiness. To quote our authors, such people find it hard to relax, to celebrate, to truly enjoy, to be thankful, to share. How can one enjoy one's fundamentally worried? How can one share when one perceives not to have enough for themselves? The world in which you hold on tightly to things because the rest of the world essentially is a threat to you. I think that's how most of us live today. And these involve deep emotional, existential issues. But the point of generosity and the point of these graphs, I think, is that by practicing these things, you can overcome those tendencies and experience some kind of personal transformation. Does faith have a role? You know these verses. Trust in the Lord. Let not your heart be troubled. Does that speak to our financial anxieties? Does that help out? Doesn't quite get me there. When last week Paul asked the class that he'd be happy if any of us would come and share in the class. It would be great to hear people's stories and hear a little about today. And that wasn't the deal when he asked me before. I was kind of passionate to talk about this topic, and I thought it would be great to talk about it during stewardship. But the truth is that this is a lot of my story. I have always struggled with money, as you can ask my wife afterwards.
For which you can thank your parents.
Right, and I will now do that. So generosity to me never really computed. And I identified a long time ago the significance of my innate selfishness. I just knew that I was not a naturally generous person. So all this about it being a learned thing really resonates with me, because I was naturally a hoarder. I thought I definitely had the scarcity view. Now, the family of origin explains that emotionally. My parents were Depression babies. Not only did they live through the Depression as babies and young children, where they experienced a little bit of what you did with your parents, seeing your parents exercise generosity. I heard the story a million times from my mother of her mother passing out egg sandwiches in the backyard to the homeless men. But it permeated their being to the point where, while I certainly heard "I love you" a lot, I heard "we can't afford it more." And that's just my family of origin. Combined with a little later abandonment issues, created a real emotional, existential sense of scarcity in myself. So being generous just didn't compute. And it didn't change until I got married. And a more generous person, somebody who didn't have the same attitude about money, who says, easy come, easy go, which of course is no way to manage your finances. But also, as we had to, for the first time, make a household and deal with finances, and learn how to deal with them in a mature Christian way in this church, was a great thing. And learning how to tithe was transformative. So really giving away those hard-won precious assets, not just of money but of time, I think can be transformative. Even though I still do hold on too tightly. And one of the themes of Dr. Barnes when he was here was about not holding on so tightly, but of releasing that and receiving your life instead of trying to hold on to it too tightly, which is characteristic of a lot of the type A people who live here and are my friends and are just like me, who are high achievers, who went to graduate school and are trying to do the best, and they're part of that baby boom generation, right? So generosity is a complex, existential, emotional thing. I cannot make this talk without making reference to my favorite phrase when it comes to discussing money in the church, which is money matters. First time I was stewardship chairman back about 1998, I came across this book that was written by a sociologist at Catholic University who made a very seminal study of giving in the American church and why people gave. Came up with a lot of great observations, one of the most important of which was that trust was really a key leadership factor. But the other was that money matters, and people have to understand that money matters, and we can talk about money in the church. David Rennick often says that Jesus talked about a lot of things, but few things he didn't talk about more often was money. So it's a great invitation for us to be able to talk about money in our lives and what it means to the church and the kingdom. What it means to the kingdom, folks, is that it's not a very rosy outlook. When Hogue wrote this book back in 1995, 45% of charitable giving went to religion in the United States. That's gone down every year since that I can find a measurement for it. And that's not surprising. That's pretty consistent with attendance in the church, right? So I would say we need to talk about church. We need to talk about money in the church. Lastly, so I thought about talking about this talk the last few months. And I heard David preach on 2 Corinthians. I have to ask the question, isn't Jesus really the ultimate paradox? For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. How interesting that Paul used economic money terms to describe Jesus. And I wondered if he was reflecting the old proverb, which also is a financial thing. So as much as we're gifted moneyologists in our own time, these ideas are ancient. And to see Christ in an economic metaphor still resonates. But the paradox of his life, certainly we think of him as ironic. Parables certainly is paradox. But the great surprise that the least of us could inherit the kingdom, that a child could become king. All those things tied to the paradox of generosity, and I think in a way define our humanity. And make a great thing for us to think about maybe as we begin to celebrate Thanksgiving. And that's the paradox of generosity. Anything you'd like to discuss?
This is a great talk. I'm a skinflint, and I come from a long line of hard-scrabble Yankee farmers. My father graduated from Cornell, as did both his brothers, and that's we have four of a fairly hard-scrabble family. And I think the other thing that's happened, I can look back into the 60s and say, look, I know where I'm going. And the thing is, I had to change. I started out in art school and switched over to teaching history, and after that I became a government guy. But there was this kind of biblical thing through it, and it's like the talents, what do you do? The thing that you haven't brought up, you kind of touched on this, but the world is getting tighter for young people. The kind of
Say that louder, the world is
getting tighter for young people. The kind of things I could do in the 60s. That degree of freedom, I don't think, is in the lust of young people today, going away to school. I went to England because England passed a rule. Any foreign student who can get into a British university will take them on for the graduate programs. And I was able to get through the University of London for $300 a year. And that was a great bargain in the context of the late 60s.
My personal opinion, there's more locomotion than there was for more people because the cost of transportation has gone down.
Yes.
So not all that many people got to do what you did.
I would say this, that the percentage of money you spend in transportation crossing the ocean once a year, which is what I was dealing with, is a pretty small percentage. And I looked at the people I was going to school with, and I grew up outside of Boston, which of course was a kind of neighborhood that may be always looking for the major chance.
Right. Our son just finished college, and one of the big changes I saw was that the majority of kids spend a semester overseas. I mean, it's just amazing. It's a given that you're going to do that. Now, the question is, that's not every college in America. That's not every university. That's not every education. It's still costly. And so only a certain number of people afford that kind of education. And then what happens afterwards? Do they still engage in that kind of, do they still have that kind of economic freedom to continue to do those kinds of things? I think is a little closer to what you're trying to say. That maybe they are encumbered by debt. And they're not as footloose and fancy.
Could you develop this? Because I think this debt and the sense of crushing debt really contrasts with what the openness I remember from the 60s when I was finishing grad school to what is going on today. Kids who are getting ahead seem to be, and I spend a lot of time with them. In fact, I give them a lot of money. That's where most of it goes. Trying to pick out the really good kids who have the brains play the game. And I think that's the new helpful thing that I see in the overall picture. I'll say graduate school in particular.
Wonderfully illuminating, John. I'm surprised that since you drew on sociologists so much, that they did not include generosity within the extended family. And I think that there's tremendous disparity between different families and how much different generations or different people with success or not success share among those extended family members. And as things get tighter, I think some of that generosity goes within the family instead of outside the family.
I'm not quitting, I'm still back to it. The question is, your paradox, I understand your paradox, I think it's very clear. You're happier if you're generous, even though it doesn't seem like you're going to be. But this is a Christian church. I mean, that's a truth for all people, no matter if they're people of faith or if they're not. But we're here in a Christian church. And what worries me a lot about preaching here and about what you said about this is our purpose in coming here every Sunday to be happier, to make ourselves happier?
You asking me?
Well, is that
No.
Is that part of what you're saying? Is that your point?
No. I would say that the point of this actually what's interesting about this is this book isn't about religion at all. It's trying to make a more broad societal point, that the society would be more virtuous if people were more giving. The Christian question I've always thought was an interesting one because the Declaration of Independence doesn't promise happiness, it promises the pursuit of happiness, and God doesn't promise happiness either. So, are we allowed to be happy? Sure. Are we guaranteed happiness? I don't think so.
Yeah, but that's not the question. What is our purpose? What is our purpose in coming here? What is our orientation with respect to Jesus Christ and our lives?
Right.
I mean, Jesus looked at that woman who put everything in there, and he approved that. He spoke highly of that. We don't know if she was happy or not.
I understand.
Seeking first the kingdom of God, does that mean you're going to be happy?
Right. I'll help you out here and put it in money terms. It's that altruism slide. One of the things that I kind of struggle with is when I give to the church, it's self-interested. It's because I like wrestler's class. You know? I want to be sure we can have wrestler's class. That's different than giving it to Central Union Mission, isn't it? That's more altruistic. So it's also that I am an evangelical. I want to evangelize for Jesus Christ. That's my gift to the church. Is that self-interested? A little bit. So I think there is a difference in those things. And we are called to expand the church as a Christian. I think that's pretty clear. But there is a difference there as to what's self-serving and what's altruistic. And I think there's a tension.
John? It's funny, I sort of got a little different take on it too, but is that we're called on, it's interesting what this is doing. We're called on in the Bible to give back to God. And what this is doing, interestingly, is showing you that by doing that, just like the Bible says, it'll actually be positive for you. And so he's showing us philosophically, that's not the right word, emotionally, how the things that the Bible says to do actually are reflected in our spirits. That the data shows that by doing what we're called upon to do, whether or not you feel like doing it, it comes out to be positive. So I guess I'm agreeing that John has actually given us a really good perspective here that should fit well with our Christian ethics.
Except that, that's
No.
data, and
No,
yes,
not
overall
except,
it's true.
but he has.
But that doesn't mean that is going to be true for every single person.
Well, okay, I think we're going to have to close it off here. John, thank you for provoking our thinking on this paradox of generosity. There's a lot of things that we can wrestle with here, right? Maybe we'll come back and revisit this in the spring. I think it's a good topic to continue to discuss, and I have some questions I'd like to ask too. But anyway, thank you so much for coming.